Come with me. I'll show you what a real factory dinner looked like when there was almost nothing to cook.
In butcher shops and boarding houses across industrial cities like Pittsburgh, there was a dish called city chicken, sold throughout the Great Depression, that never contained a single feather of actual chicken. Here are 14 real dinners that fed factory workers across the United States, each one carrying the identity of the immigrant community that brought it into America's industrial cities.
Before we continue, subscribe now. Item 1 on this list has a name that still fools people today. And the reason behind it is smarter than it sounds.
City chicken. In butcher shops and boarding houses across Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and other industrial Great Lakes cities, a dish called city chicken was sold throughout the Great Depression, and it never contained a single feather of actual chicken. Polish and Ukrainian immigrant communities working in the region's steel mills and factories created the dish by skewering cubes of pork and veal on a wooden stick, breading and frying them until they looked from a distance like a real chicken drumstick. The reason was simple. Chicken, raised on a small scale and reserved for special occasions, cost more than pork in most industrial cities of the era. The dish became so tied to the working-class identity of these cities that butcher shops in Pittsburgh and Cleveland still sell city chicken today, nearly a century later. And while the factory worker fooled his own plate into looking like a luxury, another spot in the city sold real food for coins, no trickery involved. Automat meals. In New York and Philadelphia, the Horn and Hardart chain ran restaurants where no waiter ever took an order. Customers dropped coins into a slot and opened a small glass door to pull out a fully prepared dish waiting behind it. During the Great Depression, the automat became a refuge for factory workers who needed a hot, fast, cheap meal between shifts, with no haggling over price and no waiting on service. Food was constantly restocked behind those little doors, and the clean, well-lit space stood in sharp contrast to the poverty outside, becoming almost a symbol of accessible dignity in an era of soup lines. Whole working families learned to stretch a handful of coins in these restaurants, splitting dishes and using the free hot water to make their own tea with a bag brought from home. But not every worker had a big city with an automat nearby. Blue Plate Special. In diners and cheap restaurants across the country, a compartmentalized plate with meat, 2 sides, and bread was sold at one fixed price throughout the Great Depression. Nicknamed the Blue Plate Special for the color of the porcelain plate it was served on. That fixed price eliminated any surprise at the moment of paying, a valuable guarantee for factory workers counting coins before ever stepping into a restaurant. The divided plate also cut down on dishwashing and prep time, letting cheap restaurants serve high volumes of workers during the tight lunch window between factory shifts. It became so common that the name Blue Plate Special outlived the blue porcelain plate itself by decades, long after it had disappeared from most American kitchens. And when a worker didn't even have coins for a Blue Plate Special, dinner came from home, carried in a metal pail since morning. Factory workers' Hungarian goulash. In industrial neighborhoods with a strong Hungarian immigrant presence, in parts of Cleveland and Chicago, goulash, a thick stew of beef, onion, and paprika, became a recurring dinner among working families who had brought the recipe from Central Europe. Paprika, cheap and easy to preserve, gave concentrated flavor to tougher, cheaper cuts of meat, stretched further with potato and onion into larger portions. Unlike many American thrift recipes born during the Depression itself, goulash already existed as a family tradition before the crisis, and its practicality of stretching a little meat into many servings only became more valuable as factory wages shrank. Cooked in a single large pot, it needed little fuel and little attention once set to simmer, letting the family keep working while dinner cooked itself. It was identity food and survival food at once, and the same would hold true for another dish of Polish origin in the very same cities.
You've seen 4 of these 14 dinners so far. But hold on to this. Item 9 explains something incredible. about why millions of Italian-American families grew up eating a pasta version that barely resembles the real Italian recipe. And item 14 isn't even a recipe. It's the very way the whole meal happened.
Potato and cheese pierogi. In Polish communities across Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Chicago, pierogi, thin dough pockets filled with mashed potato and cheese, boiled and then pan-fried in butter or bacon fat, became a dinner hearty enough to feed an entire working family from just a few basic ingredients. The dough, made only of flour, egg, and water, could be prepared in bulk on a single Sunday and frozen or stored for several dinners across the factory work week. Polish churches in industrial cities organized community pierogi sales as a way to raise funds during the Depression, making the dish as tied to these communities' identity as it was to the neighborhood's actual economic survival. Serving pierogi was at once feeding the family and keeping alive a tradition carried over from Poland decades earlier. And when cabbage from the backyard garden was left over, it almost always ended up on the table alongside this very dish: kielbasa and cabbage-smoked Polish sausage, sliced and sautéed with thinly cut cabbage, onion, and a splash of vinegar, was one of the most recurring dinners in Polish and Eastern European working-class neighborhoods throughout the 1930s. The sausage, smoked to last weeks without refrigeration, produced enough flavor to season a large amount of cabbage, the cheapest and most available vegetable for much of the year in any working-class neighborhood market. A single whole sausage could season enough cabbage to feed a family of 6 or 8 for more than one dinner, stretching the cost of meat into a fraction of what buying fresh meat in larger cuts would cost. The dish traveled with the immigrants themselves from Europe and adapted easily to American industrial life, where cabbage was even cheaper than it had been back in these workers' home countries. But not all the cabbage went into the pan whole. Sometimes it became the wrapper for the meal itself. Cabbage rolls, gołąbki. Lightly boiled cabbage leaves were used to wrap a mixture of ground meat, rice, and onion, forming small rolls slowly simmered in a thin tomato sauce. A traditional Polish dish that became the perfect meat-stretching dinner for Depression-era working families. A small amount of ground meat mixed with rice for bulk produced dozens of rolls able to feed an entire family, multiplying the yield of an expensive ingredient through a cheap, abundant one. The dish required considerable prep time, rolling each one by hand, which made it more common on Sundays, when there was time available outside the factory shift for that kind of slow manual work. Serving gołąbki was, for many Polish families, a weekend ritual that survived even in the hardest years of the economic crisis. And while the family at home rolled cabbage, the night shift worker depended on a cold metal pail just to get through his own shift.
Before we continue, take a guess. What do you think a poor Italian-American family used instead of tomato sauce when they had no money to buy any? The answer is sitting in your own kitchen right now. And it's coming in the next item.
The factory workers' cold pail. Dinner night shift workers in steel mills and factories carried their own dinner in a metal pail, usually bread with some sliced cold meat, a piece of cheese, and, if there was any left over, a slice of plain cake, eaten quickly during the single short break allowed in the middle of an 8 or 10-hour shift. With no refrigeration available inside the factory, the food had to be something that could sit at room temperature for hours without spoiling, limiting the options to items already cooked and cold, never freshly prepared hot dishes. The metal pail itself became as tied to factory worker identity as the work overalls, appearing in period photographs beside factory gates at shift change. For families with more than one adult working different shifts, preparing these pails became an entire daily routine, organized around the entry and exit times of every factory in the area. But when there was time to cook at home, a cheap Italian dish dominated the table in many working families. Spaghetti with ketchup. In working-class neighborhoods with a strong Italian presence, when there was no fresh tomato and no money for canned sauce, families substituted the traditional pasta sauce with bottled ketchup. mixed with a little water and fat to stretch into a thin red sauce, but enough to cover an entire pot of pasta. The practice, a running joke today among descendants of these very families, was born from pure budget math. A bottle of ketchup lasted through far more dinners than a can of real tomato sauce would at the same price. For children who grew up eating this way, it was simply the normal taste of home spaghetti, with no idea a different version even existed until years later. The adaptation shows how entire culinary traditions bent themselves to fit the budget, even losing the original recipe along the way. And when even ketchup ran out, the solution came from a corn grain cooked slow, also brought over from Italy. Factory workers' polenta coarse cornmeal, slowly cooked in water until it thickened into a dense yellow mass, was served hot with whatever sauce or fat was on hand, or sliced and fried the next day when leftovers cooled, a dish brought by Italian immigrants from northern Italy into American industrial cities. Corn, far cheaper than refined wheat, produced portions large enough to feed an entire family for very little money. And the same pot of polenta could become two different meals, hot on one day and fried the next. Italian communities in factory cities preserved the recipe as part of their own identity, even while surrounded by Polish, Hungarian, and German neighbors doing the exact same kind of adaptation with their own traditional dishes. It was once again proof that every working-class neighborhood in industrial America ate its own version of the same problem. Little money, a lot of hunger, and a family recipe carried from another continent to solve both.
That's 10 of 14 dinners revealed so far. But item 14 sums up, in a single sentence, the real experience of eating during the Great Depression in American cities. Keep going until then.
Beer and pretzel dinner. In neighborhoods with a strong German presence, a simple dinner of salted pretzels and cheap beer served at the corner tavern worked as a full meal for workers who left the factory with no energy or time left to cook at home. Pretzels, baked in bulk and sold for pennies, provided enough carbohydrate to hold off hunger until the next morning's breakfast, while beer, cheaper than any bottled soda in some neighborhoods of the era, filled out the calories needed after a full shift of heavy physical labor. Working-class neighborhood taverns functioned almost as an extension of the factory itself, the place where shift co-workers met before heading home, making the meals social as well as caloric. The practice dropped sharply during Prohibition, but roared back the moment Prohibition was repealed in 1933, right in the middle of the Depression's worst stretch. But not every working-class neighborhood had a tavern. Some only had the company store. Company store credit dinner. In company towns where a single textile or steel firm controlled nearly all local commerce, workers bought that night's dinner at the company store using credit scrip deducted directly from their pay. A system that tied the family financially to its employer in a way almost identical to what happened in railroad camps and coal mines of the same era. Prices at these stores tended to run higher than at any independent market, but the family rarely had a real alternative, since the entire town had been built around a single factory with no commercial competition nearby. Dinner bought this way could be whatever was on the shelf that week, from canned meat to pickled vegetables, with no real menu choice beyond whatever the company decided to stock. This system created a dependency that went far beyond food, literally shaping where the family lived, shopped, and existed, all under the control of the same employer. And when even the company store came up short, one specific German recipe from Cincinnati solved the problem with a mixture that sounds impossible. Cincinnati Geta. In Cincinnati and nearby areas with a strong German immigrant presence, a mixture of ground pork, organ meat, and cooked oats formed a loaf that hardened in a pan, was sliced and fried like a dense patty, producing entire dinners and breakfasts from very little actual meat. Oats, far cheaper than pure meat, let a small amount of pork stretch into a large amount of food. A total use principle almost identical to Pennsylvania scrapple, but with oats standing in for cornmeal as the dish's base. Geta became so central to Cincinnati's identity that the city still holds an annual festival dedicated entirely to the dish. decades after any real need to stretch meat had faded from most American families' lives. It was survival food that over time turned into regional pride, a pattern that repeats across several dishes on this entire list. And the last dinner on this list didn't come from any specific recipe. It came from the very structure of the house where the family ate. The boarding house dinner, boarding house reach. In industrial cities packed with single workers or families renting out spare rooms to boost income, the communal boarding house dinner gathered 10, 15, or more people at the same long table, sharing serving dishes that had to stretch to feed everyone at once. Reaching across a neighbor's plate to grab more food before a dish emptied became so common at that kind of crowded table that it earned its own name, the boarding house reach, still used today to describe that exact move at any packed table. The landlady had to calculate portions that would stretch across every border on the same tight budget any working family faced, multiplied by however many mouths were seated at the table that night. This communal dinner sums up better than any single dish on this list the real experience of eating during the Great Depression in America's industrial cities. It was never about what was on the plate. It was about making sure there was enough plate to go around before the food ran out. These 14 dinners show that American factory worker food was never just one thing. It was Polish on one street, Italian on the next, German on the one behind it. Each immigrant community solving the same hunger with its own recipe carried from another continent. And in the end, it never mattered where the dish came from. What mattered was whether it stretched far enough for everyone sitting at that table that night. Which of these 14 dinners do you recognize from your own family's kitchen, even without knowing it came from the Great Depression? Subscribe now, because the next video reveals another forgotten group from American history. Comment below. Which dish surprised you the most on this list?
Even without knowing it came from the Great Depression. Subscribe now. The next video reveals another forgotten group from American history. Come see how I filled this same pail every single day, just to survive the shift.